I'm straight out of New York. It had nothing to do with me. I didn't see nothing, I didn't hear nothing, I didn't know anything.
We were all very fortunate that no one died.
There is never a level playing field when it comes to doping. It's just wrong.
U.S. Olympic officials are investigating charges that members of the U.S. bicycle team were involved in blood doping before the Los Angeles Games.
I was your Harry Potter out of Harlem that had a magic wand, and I learned to use it.
It was a moral decision, but as far as how illegal it was, they still haven't come to a decision on that.
When you have a chance to do it, go for it, because the chance may never come again.
You know, American cyclists had not won medals since 1912.
Athletes know better than anyone that there's more, much more, to the Olympic experience than winning medals.
A blood bag was on the floor and an IV was in the donor's arm.
And it's a very subjective personal judgment as to what the limits are.
If you wanted to be on Lance Armstrong's tour team, then you had to dope.
And I knew there would be hell to pay.
A little truth is sometimes a very dangerous thing.
If you think you're too big to get caught, think again.
Really a compelling story to revisit, and it's my privilege to be able to introduce all of our panelists. As you saw at the very end, a number of people involved with the scandal in 1984 refused to be interviewed for the film, but a number of the people who were interviewed for the film are here with us tonight, so that's pretty exciting. So I want to start with our filmmaker, Jill Yesko. Jill Yesko is a New Jersey native, now living in Baltimore. She's a former elite cyclist, having competed in the U.S. Olympic trials and the World University Games. She has completed coursework toward a PhD in cultural geography and is now an author, journalist, and filmmaker. Her writing has appeared in magazines such as Women's Sports and Fitness, Shape, Fitness, and Swimmer. Jill does not only write about sports, she's also the author of 2 crime fiction novels, and her worldwide travels have made her the subject of a feature in Oprah Winfrey's O magazine. As the director of Tainted Blood, she combines her experience in cycling with her talent for storytelling in order to explore the promise and price of Olympic glory. Inga Thompson, who we saw in the film, Inga Thompson is originally from Salt Lake City, I believe. Yes? Salt Lake City?
Where I was born.
Okay. And now makes her home on a 160-acre ranch in eastern Oregon. She began her athletic career as a runner, but an injury led her instead to cycling. From 1984 to 1993, she won 10 national championships, reached the podium twice at the Women's Tour de France, and competed in 3 Olympic Games. Over the years, she has been a vocal advocate for women's sports and, as her website states, a clean sport evangelist. In 2017, she founded the Inga Thompson Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting women cyclists and drug-free competition. John Hoberman. John Hoberman is a professor of Germanic Studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a social and cultural historian who's researched and published extensively in the fields of sports studies, race studies, human enhancements, medical history, and globalization studies. His most recent book, which was published late last year, is called Dopers in Uniform, The Hidden World of Police on Steroids. As ominous as it sounds, I'm afraid. Previous books that have included a focus on sports include Sport and Political Ideology, The Olympic Crisis, Sport, Politics, and the Moral Order, and Darwin's Athletes, How Sport Has Damaged Black America and Preserved the Myth of Race. He is a highly sought-after international expert and has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Canada's The National, and Germany's Der Spiegel, among numerous other outlets. And our moderator tonight is Patrick Hruby. Patrick Hruby is an award-winning writer, editor, and journalist, a graduate of Georgetown University and Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. He now resides in Washington, D.C. His work combines the journalist's art of storytelling with a critical attitude towards sports' relationship to culture and politics. This is evident in his work on a range of issues, including the failed sports war on doping, the racial injustice of big-time college sports, the tragic consequences of head trauma in college football, and perhaps most shockingly, the ways that ballpark food hijacks your brain.
Look it up. It's neuroscience. That's the neuroscience talking.
It's a little frightening. I love ballpark foods. This worries me. His work has appeared in several high-profile publications, including The Washington Post, ESPN The Magazine, USA Today, The Atlantic, Sports on Earth, Vice Sports, and Politico. Patrick is also a fellow of the Center for Sports Communication and Media here at the University of Texas at Austin. Please join me in welcoming all 4 of our panelists.
All right, well, thank you all for being here. We want to go through and have a good discussion, so we'll get started. Jill, just really quickly, how and why did you decide to revisit this particular story and make this documentary?
So I lived in Los Angeles in 1984 and attended the LA Games and watched a number of these athletes win their medals. And it was a fantastic event. You know, we really cleaned up, especially in the men's road race where we had a very exciting finish. I was racing at the time, and when the story broke a few months later that the athletes had blood doped, I was really pissed off. You know, I felt like personally let down by this. I wasn't a journalist yet, but I always kind of knew this was a great story. This was pre-internet. You know, every month we would wait for Velo News to come and devour every morsel of, you know, this little cycling tabloid. And, you know, so I waited and waited, and then Lance Armstrong happened, and I thought, oh, this is gonna, you know, this is gonna destroy doping in sports. And it didn't. And it kept happening, and I thought, I've got to tell this story. And then I became a filmmaker later in life, and I thought this is absolutely the right venue to tell this story. And I began the documentary about 4.5 years ago, and it was finished last year.
Was a process of, you mentioned in the film, the people that actually doped that we know about did not talk to you for the film, would not talk to you for the film.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of why they were reluctant even now? And what do you think that says about this story? They still won't talk about it.
Yeah, that was the big shock for me. For some reason, I thought they'd be very, very willing to tell their story, especially given that it was not technically illegal at the time, that so much time had passed, that Lance Armstrong had been the big, you know, boogeyman for cycling and doping in cycling, and what they had done was on a much more proto level. And so when I, you know, figuratively had doors slammed in my face, I was really surprised. And I kind of came to find out that by kicking this hornet's nest, as I did, that the doping that went on at the 1984 Games was very likely bigger than went beyond the blood doping. I actually found this out fairly recently. And that may have been one reason why these athletes were unwilling to participate. I think there's still a lot of shame in it. One athlete said, sure, I'll be in your film, you know, how much are you gonna pay me? There was some of that. And I said, you know, I'm not like the National Enquirer, I don't pay for interviews. And some of the athletes did speak to me off the record and tell me things, but for reasons, among them my desire not to get sued, I did not include that in the film, but I'm happy to share their anecdotes afterwards.
I mean, you could do that now if you want, or is that more for private conversations?
I'm curious. We haven't caught up.
So one of them said, you know, listen, you have to understand, I was a young man at the time, cycling, I was virtually sleeping in my car. This is John Beckman, who's in the film. This was my way of making money, and I was basically going to do whatever I had to do to win a medal. Dave Grills, who's in the film, who did not blood dope, said that he and John Beckman, he found this out later, Beckman said, as soon as I found out that you weren't blood doping, I immediately decided I was going to blood dope because I wanted your spot on the Olympic team.
It really speaks to that level of competition. John, Jill just mentioned that in '84 was sort of this proto-doping, is how you labeled it. How would you describe both doping in Olympic level sport in 1984 and also sort of anti-doping or any efforts to curtail it? Where were we at that time compared to where we are now?
Well, given that there had been rampant doping at the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games, it had been well established many years before 1984 actually happened. And what I would call would be a longstanding imbalance of power between the doping dynamic that has engulfed so many elite athletes And the anti-doping campaign, such as it has been, if you wanted to start taking it seriously, you would go back to the beginning of the year 2000 with the establishment of the World Anti-Doping Agency, which has proven to be much less effective than we expected it to be. As a matter of fact, the most pathetic example of the weakness of the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, came only a short time ago when it issued an advisory to all athletes who might be thinking about whistleblowers to the effect that WADA could not protect them. In other words, it could not protect their lives, because we know that there are, as of right now, 3 Russian whistleblowers who are hiding out in the United States, and they're in the witness protection program because Vladimir Putin is suspected of assassinating people. So that is, I mean, Putin, with the 2014 scandal and the absolute demonizing of anybody who is going to reveal it, has gangsterized the entire doping scene in a way that is absolutely unique in sports history. However rotten the IOC has been for a long time, they, to the best of my knowledge, have never performed or wanted to perform a contract killing. The other thing that has gotten curiously little
really going there tonight.
publicity is that in February of 2017, was it? 2 former directors of the Russian Anti-Doping League died within 2 weeks of each other. These are, middle-aged people, middle-aged men. Mr. Kamayev went out for a ski workout and dropped dead of a heart attack. At least that is the little bit you can find online. Mr. Sinev dies the same month for reasons I've never seen described on the internet. And so from being unwholesome, the world of doping has become literally deadly. And the Icarus film that won the Academy Award, in my opinion, deserved it. You want to see how amoral, how corrupt sport is at that level, then you've probably seen it. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Jill for making a great film.
Oh, thank you, John.
This is just a tremendously compelling work of documentary art that dramatizes the ethical dimensions of this in a tremendously effective way. She didn't get to the murder part because it hadn't quite happened yet. But the seriousness of the weakness of the anti-doping camp, shall we say, has been given a whole new dimension by the insolence and the amorality of Vladimir Putin. Classic sportive nationalist who is willing to go farther than anybody has gone before.
You use the word amorality, which, different than immoral, amoral, sort of just a lack completely. Inga, one of the things I found very striking about the film was this wasn't against the rules at the time, blood doping, right? Yeah, right. It wasn't yet against the rules. And you see these US cycling executives openly discussing it like in a memo. Hey, maybe we should do this. We should have some meetings and talk about this and think about this. And then, the guy at the charge is like, oh, I decided not to do it, but they just did anyway. There wasn't like a really strong push to not do this. It's like, well, I guess it's in the rules. We can go ahead and do it. I think you see someone else in the movie describing it as no different than going to Pikes Peak and training at altitude for a few months. What do you make of that as an athlete, and does that seem amoral to you in a way that was even happening at the time?
It's absolutely amoral. I mean, if you want to blood boost and you want to go train on the top of the peak, then fine, go do it. But, taking blood from your relative, taking blood from yourself, absolutely not. But I get a little bit strict in this because, now the whole big thing is like, say, therapeutic use exemption. Well, your testosterone's a little low, so we're going to bring you up to this level.
Can you explain to everybody what that means in the context of sports and doping?
Yeah, therapeutic use exemption is like, oh, if you have asthma, and you see Christopher Frome caught up in this one, if you have asthma, we'll give you this asthma inhaler, and it's going to help you. Well, if you have asthma, you have asthma. Your testosterone's a little bit low, so we're going to give you a patch and bring your testosterone up to a natural level. Well, when you're an endurance athlete, your testosterone drops off. I don't think that you should be able to take it back up. I mean, you're taking drugs again. I think any time that you get into trying to manipulate your system from what your body is naturally trying to do is just wrong. But if you can, naturally do it by saying going to the top of Pikes Peak, absolutely.
You do see in a lot of sports now, like curiously high levels of ADHD, therapeutic use exemptions for Adderall, asthma levels, and
right, and they keep it right below the legal level.
And the percentages of the athletes that have these versus the general population that would have these conditions, it seems like it's mysteriously higher.
Well, I mean, you can take it to the next level. I have an unfair advantage because I have a really long femur. So you go in and get an operation and get a long femur, so it gives you the advantage. I mean, what point do you take it? As a woman right now, I have a lot of people say, oh, you ought to get back in sports. I'm like, well, no, I'm absolutely not. I'm taking hormones right now because I'm an older, middle-aged woman. Well, you can do that therapeutic use exemption. I'm like, absolutely not. I'm going to race clean. And to take these things to keep me at this level, I just think is cheating. But I get real black and white and unyielding in this area.
Do you feel like you're sort of at the far end of the spectrum in terms of when people debate this issue? You think you're kind of more on one side of it?
Yeah, I hate this trying to justify cheating, because that's what I call it. You're trying to justify it.
So is cheating for you? It goes beyond this is against the rules, and it sounds like it goes to something deeper, like it's against some sort of spirit or some sort of the point of sport and the why you're doing it.
I got really sick of, I don't know if I'm answering your question here, but I got so sick of everybody looking for the magic snake oil that was going to give them that edge. Oh, take bee pollen. Oh, bee shots. It's like garlic is the way to go. I was like, come on, you guys, why don't you just, instead of obsessing about what you can get from somebody, some drug, something over the counter, something that you may or may not, they were so obsessed with getting that advantage, instead of putting that obsession into just training harder. And that's where it gets to me just like way out of line. That in sports, I think that you do attract obsessive compulsive people looking for that edge, which is kind of sad, but you got to be obsessive compulsive to want to get to that point. I mean, none of us are quite wired normally.
But last time on a bike, I don't know if you could be wired totally normally.
Yeah.
Do you have a question back there? I mean, yeah, why not?
Right.
Go for it.
So I drink coffee and wake up. What is considered and defined an illegal drug? Like they're saying doping was not on the boards back then, it eventually became that way. Today I'm assuming there are some drugs which are not considered, but probably will be in a couple of years. How does a committee make its decision on what is a performance enhancing drug as opposed to, say, eating an apple beforehand?
So I want to let John answer that, but I do want to mention, you mentioned coffee and caffeine. That used to be actually a drug that was, in certain quantities, considered doping. And actually, there's a really famous story about, I think the last athlete to be suspended for this before they started changing the rules, John, you probably remember this too, there's a tennis player. He's at a tournament in Europe. I think he might have been an Italian player, but don't hold me on the nationality part of it. And essentially, he goes to this tournament, he's waiting for his match, he's hanging out at like the sponsor, the tournament's in Italy, excuse me, and so there's an espresso company, it's like the sponsor, hanging out at the commonly espresso bar. One of the waitresses there is cute. So he keeps just hanging out there, he's like pounding way more coffees than he usually would because he wants to chat this girl up. Goes, does his match, takes his test, and fails the test. Has too much caffeine in his system. I think eventually he was cleared because of the extenuating circumstance. He wasn't trying to cheat, He had no goal in mind. And they eventually changed the rule. But I think your question does have merit, sort of, where do you draw the line and what do you consider doping versus not doping? And how they decide that. John, do you want to sort of field how that's decided, and then maybe how it should be decided?
Not only does that question have merit, it has tremendous merit. I mean, this is a problem I've been thinking about for 30 years. Right, let's listen to the officials. Here is the Medical Commission of the International Olympic Committee. Doping is the administration of, or the use by, a competing athlete of any substance foreign in the body or of any physiological substance taken in abnormal quantity or taken by an abnormal route of entry into the body with the sole intention of increasing in an artificial and unfair manner his performance in competition. Now, we could spend the rest of the night analyzing that, and we won't. I'll just, I mean, this is a terrific question. It's a great thinking question. I mean, students could write papers for a year about this one. I'll just tell you about a conclusion I came to many years ago when I was writing a book about the history of doping, and it suddenly occurred to me, it is impossible to provide any sort of perfectly logical or airtight definition of doping. See, that is the really essential point. For decades and decades, you can see what is doping being debated. And the conclusion I came to, for what it is worth, was that the most important thing is not to be able to do the impossible, which is to say a completely airtight, consistent definition of doping. It is rather to draw a line and respect that line. And which, by the way, most of us do in modern society all the time. That, to me, the key issue of doping is not the biochemistry of it. It's the human relations aspect. Either you are a member of a community and respect the rules, and therefore you're fellow members of that community, or you don't. Now, Inga Thompson happens to be an absolutely ideal example of a community of high-performance athletes who drew a line and decided to live by it. And either you do that or you don't. And what I referred to in the film is the tragedy of high-performance sport is that the temptations are just too much for a very large number of people who, from the standpoint of the anti-doping athlete, spoil the whole thing. And that was one of the really great things about the end of Jill's film, is where she takes some of these protagonists and shows the results of disillusion. You know, the one of these fellows, you know, bowing his head, sort of resigned to the awfulness of what has happened, and that the Olympic dream that was the greatest thing in his life has wretchedly been turned inside out because the worm of the lack of integrity has entered the apple, and that's the end. And that is what modern people, we are performance obsessed. We have lost interest in self-restraint as a human virtue, which was part of the Victorian sport ethos, which is somehow hanging on along with, the Lance Armstrong thing and all the rest. So you asked, in a certain sense, the greatest question of them all.
You know what? Let's take another question. Go for it.
That was amazing. I could listen to him all night.
Yeah, that really was. I think our work here is done. That's fine. Good night, everybody. Please, go ahead.
So, given the limitations in regulating and enforcing doping and sort of this sense of like it's always been there and it always will be there, and even sort of coming off of what you were just saying, like, to some extent I don't necessarily think the Russians think the same way about doping as we are thinking about it here. So, given all of that, is it still worth caring about? Like, is it like a battle you can't win?
Is that for me?
Anybody has a
I mean, I can give you my thoughts as a journalist, but I would rather have the people who are more involved speak first, and then maybe I'll fill in if there's anything left to say.
Well, I always know my opinion. It's fun to hear somebody else's too.
Jill, do you want to take this? And can you put in the context of working on this film and let us know if maybe any of your opinions and feelings and thoughts about this changed or evolved by doing the work behind this film?
Yeah, that's a good question. Inga, I think I started out in your camp. It's like, this is just wrong, absolutely wrong. And I do still feel that way. But, having done more research and just read everything I could about doping and talked to people, including my conversations with you, John, leading up to our interview, it does seem these days like an uphill battle, particularly since, as John pointed out, that the World Anti-Doping Organization, WADA, and its counterpart USADA, and all of the other anti-doping organizations in the various countries have the challenges. Sometimes you just think, oh my God, like, we'll never be able to get a handle on this. So some people would put forth the argument, well, why don't we just allow doping to happen? Just allow doping to happen. That will create a level playing field, And that is really a false argument too, in my opinion, because then you would still have countries like the United States or Soviet Union or, say, Germany, any first world country that would have all the resources in the world to do the latest version of gene doping or whatever is down the pike. And then you might have a country like Morocco or let's say Chile or somebody like that who would have next level doping, like human growth hormone, whatever is on the market now. And then you would have another country like, I don't know, Mauritius or something that would have blood doping. So you would still not have a level playing field, but everyone would still be able to dope. So essentially you'd kind of be in the same place you are now. So that's sort of my standard answer. It's sort of, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. When we were talking earlier, I mean, one solution might be to completely divorce USADA from the IOC, give it all the money and resources that it deserves, strengthen, make all of the anti-doping labs in every country state-of-the-art, and go wild for 5 years. See if you can catch everybody. Stiffen the penalties, as Inga said. You're like, one strike, you're out. I think right now there is just too much leniency with the therapeutic exemptions and the fact that there is so much appeal that an athlete can essentially, just wait it out forever and then come back. I mean, the current system we have now is very broken and is not serving anybody well.
Can I follow on that for a second?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that what you said about the system not working and not serving anyone well is completely correct. I think it's a failure. I mean, just from being a reporter and having looked at it, I think it's largely futile. I mean, I don't think it's it's probably designed to do this, but it's certainly something where catch a few people, but not too many. And I think some of that is because the inherent nature of trying to actually catch people is really difficult. Like, they're almost always going to be 1 or 2 steps ahead of whatever sort of detection system you put into place. A lot of people I've talked to, people like I don't know, John, I don't know if you're in this camp, but other people have studied this problem for much longer than I have. Academics have studied it. They've told me, if you really want to put a dent in doping in sports, you need to, instead of fighting a sports war on drugs that revolves around testing, you really need to make it like the actual war on drugs, where it involves police. And you have incredibly harsh, draconian police work going on, where you were like investigating and going after people with the tools of actual police. And I'm not sure anyone wants that in sports. That's a little bit of burning down the village in order to save it, in my opinion. It'd be really invasive, it'd be really expensive. And also, I don't know if it would still totally work, but it has worked. If you look at some of the major doping scandals that have come to light, very few of them came to light because of testing. It came to light literally because border police found stuff in Spain, the Tour de France. It came to light because a FBI agent was digging around the trash up in California and a guy named Victor Conti, you know. I mean, they come to light for these different, if someone's a whistleblower, right? You know, one coach wants to rat out another coach. In the case of the Russian stuff, you know, again, whistleblowers who are now fearing for their lives. I mean, so it's entered this whole other realm. And to me, is that all worth it? I don't know. I think for an athlete like yourself, that might be worth it, because I really feel for the athletes who don't want to do this, whether it's for ethical reasons or health reasons. Because let's not forget, there are potentially a lot of bad side effects from taking these drugs and using these techniques to get an edge. For those athletes, it might be worth it. And they're the biggest losers, I think, in the current system. Because they have to deal with all the invasive testing, having to pee in a cup, you know, people showing up 2 in the morning to knock on your door. And meanwhile, that system isn't really catching most of the people who are doing this and succeeding from it. So you're losing sort of on both ends. But everybody else in the system, I think if you look at it, and here's why I think it's really futile. John can say this much more eloquently, but I'll give it a shot. Everyone else in the system is kind of winning the way it is. Sports are making a ton of money. All these different organizations that run them are making money. The people who do anti-doping, I'm not saying they're in it for profit, but like their little cottage industry is going along fairly well. The athletes who are doping, in general, are making a lot of money. Lance Armstrong's not broke, despite all the lawsuits and other things that have happened to him. The sponsors are getting what they want for the most part. Sure, maybe when a scandal breaks in retrospect, oh, like Lance Armstrong was bad for our brand. I don't think Lance Armstrong was bad for Radio Shack at the time. That's not why Radio Shack went out of business. And also, above all, we, the fans, are absolutely getting what we want, which is, like John has always said this, we want superhuman performances. We want bigger, faster, stronger. We want something we've never seen before, that someone's never done before. Well, at some point you run into the limits of human physiology when you're asking for that. And there's really only one way to transcend those limits, and it's doping. And so I don't know if we, as the people who like make the whole economy of sports work, really care that much already. You ask, should we care? I would argue we don't. That's my take on it.
That's not answering the question.
Well, I'm kind of listening and I'm thinking you're part of the problem here.
I might be.
Well, because if the media is glorifying what a great athlete this is, and you have, you know, signs that the athlete is doping, at what point are we like turning this into the fairyland of like Disney? Like we teach all these little girls, you can all be a princess and, you know, have a pink pony that's, you know, blowing rainbows, but or it's like the fairy tale version of we're all gonna, you know, grow up and have 2.1 children and have the perfect life. That's just not life. But media wants to let you have that Disney life, the perfect Walt Disney life.
So would you like to see more stories that are skeptical when like a pro athlete comes
skeptical,
back from summer and says, oh, I gained 20 pounds of lean muscle in 2 months because I cut out gluten? You want to see a little more skepticism about those kind of stories?
No.
I'm in the best shape of my life.
I
started Navy SEAL training.
But maybe it's like the media not glorifying the person who dominates everything, but more kind of glorifying. I call it like the spirit of competition is today I beat you, tomorrow you're going to beat me. And it's this fair game back and forth. It's fair. And like when we watch football games where it's like the score goes back and forth, how exciting it is when we see a football game where one side dominates the other, it's just not even fair. You're like, how do you glorify that? So you could like look at Lance Armstrong dominating everybody, and instead of putting all this emphasis on him, putting the emphasis on the fair competition of this guy. Well, you know, maybe he's not Lance, but look at the effort that he's putting out. Look, you know, start glorifying the people that, you know, maybe clearly aren't doping, but saying, look at the effort this person is putting out, and look at where they have come, and look at, instead of the emphasis always on the winner. I
think that would almost be a sort of a Disney-like scenario for the media, and because we respond to what our audiences want, like especially now when we no longer have any kind of monopoly over advertising dollars, and like we're desperately trying to hold on, and Google and Facebook took our lunch and it's gone. Like we definitely have to give audiences what they want to have any chance of all of remaining in business. That's our incentive, right? And I think for the most part, we've learned what audiences want, unfortunately, is they don't want stories about, you know, the guy that finished 40th but tried really, really hard. They want stories about the guy that's just won 3 times in a row is going for number 4.
Well, they get that story as well.
Right.
But, more attention on the other people that participate in that process. Because a lot of times it's so weighted one way, it's just the person that's won. Like I always cracked up, I can't tell you how many races I've got second in, third in, not even mentioned. We're not even a competitor that's nowhere. I'm like, God, the effort that we put out, but I got second, and there's just like zero mention. It's always just about the winner. And maybe it's more, complete reporting of the whole story of what, kind of goes on behind the scenes for the whole thing to come together.
But I can tell you as a reporter and writer, like I find those stories fascinating. And I can tell you as an editor, like I probably wouldn't assign them. And I certainly as a writer would not be able to get editors to buy in usually unless there's an incredibly compelling sort of human story there that, again, you feel like people can kind of relate to. Otherwise, people want to know about who won. Unfortunately, but that's sort of
I understand.
It's a media down problem, but it's also sort of an audience up issue of what they sort of look for.
Yeah.
It's both. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the scenario that Patrick painted a few minutes ago is essentially accurate. And the reason I jumped in so rudely about your question was because our colleague, I think, was asking something like, should we, or the question, you said, well, we don't care, which is not accurate. You care, I care, Inga cares, Jill cares. There's a lot of people who care. But the harder question is, should we care? Should we care? And I'll offer an analogy, and that is, as Patrick points out, the sports world marches on. It's doing very well. Commercially, Patrick very sagely pointed out that any anti-doping agency is a bureaucracy. There are jobs on the line. There are institutional interests, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying they're corrupt, but they become part of the overall operation. And so here we are. There's a lot of people watching sports. And here's the analogy I'm suggesting. We live in a pretty civil society. There is a crime rate. We have a police force. The police force does what it can in order to, and other members of the community to keep the crime rate down. We do not abolish society, and we do not abolish police forces because there is still crime. Now, I'm not offering that as an excuse for the commercial sport that very effectively covers up a lot of doping. But I think it is a kind of splash of cold, realistic water about what we do put up with that is corrupt. It is not satisfactory. It doesn't live up to our standards, but we don't abolish the institution because these bad things are happening. And all I'm saying is that this is a model that people can think about with regard to, is it okay to still watch a sport that is compromised? Personally, I have lost interest in watching elite sport.
Well, here's my answer to it, is the police force, that was kind of interesting. But I think that, any business has a code of ethics. If you're a doctor and there's some form of malpractice, there's an ethics board with doctors, and if you do something, you can lose your license. If you're a stockbroker, you do inside trading, you lose your license. You can get a job anywhere else, but you don't get to be a stockbroker. If you've molested children, you go to jail, you do your penalty, but you don't get to go back into working with children. And in most businesses, there is a code of ethics. But we don't seem to have that in sports, because what happens is if an athlete tests positive, yeah, okay, he gets kicked out of the sport, but then he becomes a coach. I think once they test positive, you don't get to come back into the sport and be a coach. You're out. You can get a job anywhere else, but you are out of sports. And if a coach has doped an athlete, they too should be held accountable. And they're out of the sport. And I think, I'll never get elected, obviously, because of this, but I think that any time that you breach any of these areas, you are out of the sport because it happens with doctors and it happens with bankers and it happens. You look everywhere. You have a code of ethics
here. It sometimes happens with bankers. We should be
this
clear.
This is true, yeah. But you get the point that once you have breached the code of ethics, you are out of this profession. And you should not be coaching, and the coaches that dope the athletes should not be there. I think they need to go out, and I think WADA needs to be an independent run organization. And I think that's how you can clean it up, with a little bit of policing, with a little bit of, it's not going to be one thing that solves it. I think it's going to be an overall
sure.
take on it.
I have a thought on this, but you look like you're dying to jump in here.
No, I just wanted to mention something that's been very much in the news now that is, in conjunction with this, is the tremendous failure on the part of sports governing bodies to step up, not just to police doping, because
there's no code of board of ethics that say you can't be in here anymore. Every other profession has it.
Well, actually, the Ted Stevens Act, I think, mandates that they have to be that the coaches who have molested athletes have to go. It just has not been enforced. So this is,
if there are not actual practical consequences, it's hard to incentivize people to
or have some type of a policing agency to
you can't put the onus on the national governing bodies for sports, because inherently they are all, from what I've seen, read, and the conversations I've had with athletes who are trying to reform, like in speed skating and canoeing and kayaking, and certainly you and I both know from cycling, these are not people we can count on to clean house. I don't know what extra layer, internally or externally, who would even do that.
I think it'd have to be a separate committee that it would be that oversees.
John, are you going to take on that job?
No, but I mean, this is an excellent point, that there is simply nobody in charge. That you cannot you cannot yank people out of top positions in sport administration. I'm talking about globally, not just nationally, unless they manage somehow to very obviously disgrace themselves the way the people at FIFA did. And I'll offer an observation addressed to all of this based on about 40 years of observation, and that is the number of amoral, opportunistic, occasionally criminal people who recruit themselves into the upper echelons of sports organizations globally and nationally is really astonishing. I mean, Jill just pointed out the people who might clean this up are simply not there. They're not reliable, and that is exactly the case. And I spent decades waiting for international sports governance to melt down of its own corruption, which is exactly what has been happening over the past several years. I never thought I'd live to see the day, but they have. Never have the reputations of international federations in the IOC been at a lower ebb, and they earned it.
So here's my question about that, though, is it is true we have investigations, and some people have lost their signatures and their posts, and maybe, I guess, whatever reputation they had for running FIFA, although I don't know if the people in charge of FIFA ever had good reputations. Yeah. But are we just sort of in a position where, yes, but the World Cup still brings in billions and billions of dollars to FIFA, and essentially, here's the new boss, same as the old boss. Is anything really changing, except do we shuffle some people out, have a few committee reports, maybe slap the cuffs on a few people, and then 5 years later, it's all back to the same business as usual? When it comes to doping, when it comes to bribery, when it comes to all these kind of corrupt things we see in sports.
I think there's too much of that. Mm-hmm. I mean, open the New York Times this morning, and it turns out the Austrian police have raided the headquarters of the International Biathlon Union. Mm-hmm. Oh, really? Because of some
skiing and shooting, say it ain't so.
It's so. Guns. It's in the New York Times. It must be true. But it's just one more example of how widespread the lack of quality people is. And, you know, my favorite sort of cliche when people have brought up this, well, you know, how do you clean this up? You know, what are you going to do about the quality of the president of the IOC? And I said, well, the Pope can't do it. he's too busy. But the point is, you're looking for a skyhook. You're looking for some super duper, global authority who can take out a global authority such as the people who lead the IOC. Excuse me for a second. Yeah. This colleague had a question.
I was just curious, mainly for Jill, but certainly Dr. Hoberman and Inga, you can add in. When you were going through the film, and Dr. Hoberman, you touched on this beforehand, what is the purpose of elite sport? And did your understanding of the purpose of elite sport change or alter in any way over the course of the film? I think, Dr. Hoberman, you summed it up really well earlier in that we expect superhuman performances, yet we don't allow them access to superhuman modifying type of materials. And if that's the case, I think there's a distance between what athletes understand elite sport as and what fans and corporate sponsors expect elite sport to be. Is there, sort of jumping around with the question, I'll simplify, what is your perception of elite sport and did it change?
This is another great question, because here's a note I took before this discussion, and this is my favorite question. What is sport for? That's your question. Yeah. What is it all for? And this is a question that Inga addressed very eloquently in the film towards the end when she basically asked, what am I doing this for? And she explained it very clearly. She's an inspirational figure rather than a disappointment. And the heck of it is, I think that all of us, if you want to get serious about your relationship to high-performance sport, you have to make a decision, and hopefully an informed decision, about what you're willing to put up with.
Yeah. She has probably, of all the athletes I've ever met, the most well-adjusted, healthy conception of like what sport means to her and what it should mean within her own life. And we had a discussion before this, so I can't get into all the reasons why I'm saying that. But it's actually astonishing, and I'm almost astonished that you were so good anyway, because you so put sport like it's sort of, in my opinion, like its most healthy place within who you are and your own identity, and it's kind of amazing to me. And I think that you're more the exception than the rule, probably at that elite level.
As I've gotten older, I realize that I'm the exception because I'm watching all of my friends that I've known over the years. And it's kind of sad to watch, but they're all OCD. And I'm watching a lot of their lives just like fall apart. They're into drugs, alcohol, oxycodones, and they haven't been able to refocus their life into something really positive. They kind of go from one obsessive thing to the next obsessive thing.
There's a level of, if what you do becomes too much of who you are, that can be a little dangerous, it sounds like. And especially if you're kind of obsessive compulsive about what you do.
Yeah, I mean, they lived, eat, and breathed it, where I was more like, when I'm on my bike, but when I got off my bike, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to be around it. I don't want to go do interviews. I don't want to be around the cycling group. Let me away from this. And, my passion was like, gardening and the ranch and horses. And I wanted to be within a healthy environment because the athletes are so competitive and so driven. I mean, for me, it was like emotionally too much. I needed a break from it so that when I was with it, I could really embrace it and really love it. But I think with anything, when you're in it 24/7 all the time, I can't do that. But the obsessive compulsive person, that's all they can do, and they can't break away from that. And
so when they suddenly do not have this kind of cycle of training and competing anymore to sort of hang their obsessive compulsiveness around, things get dicey in their life.
Yeah, and some of them manage really well. They get into, a lot of them are highly educated. They become doctors, they become lawyers, and so they have continued to, focus themselves into something they can completely go into. I think one of the saddest stories is Rebecca Twigg, one of the gals that doped on here. She got a silver medal in the road race. She now lives in a van under a bridge. Oh. And this is highly educated, highly intelligent, driven woman then, and she was under Eddie B's wing. She would do anything for Eddie B. I mean, to the point that it was not healthy, and it's heartbreaking to see where this woman is now. And you know, one of my people that I raced with, you know, I don't think she'll be around for another year or two because she's drinking herself to death, and I can watch her on Facebook go on to all of these rants and all of these, you know, it's been going on for years, and I can watch again and again and again. Some have gotten into professions and have focused themselves, and a lot of them are on crash.
They weren't able to find something
right.
healthy to cope with that sort of obsessive compulsiveness.
Yeah, and seeing some of them kind of die early from it. It's hard to watch, especially as we get older and watches what happened to us, you know, 30, 40 years later now.
We had a question over here. I know you've been waiting for a while. Appreciate your patience.
A lot of excellent points. A couple of them stand out to me. One, we're talking about what can be done beyond what the governing body is. And I immediately thought of the NCAA and the FBI in college basketball, where the FBI got involved and there was a lot of money changing hands. But what's going to happen is that those people are now going to find other ways. They're going to get the money another way. They're not going to be talking to agents who they don't realize are agents. So there'll be a way.
You're saying a black market will continue to be a black market.
Yeah, but that's what's going to take. The NCAA obviously could not do anything about it, but the FBI did what the NCAA couldn't do. But still, there'll be a way to get around it. Following up on that for Inga, how do you not, knowing that there were athletes out there doing that, and there are those that are not doing that, how do you not let it drive you over? You're just talking about people that you know. How do you let it not drive you over the edge that the playing field is not even close to being level?
Because you said at the end of the movie, I just want to follow up. You said that one day, every now and then, when you beat someone you know is doping, was like the best feeling. And I thought to myself, that's really great. What about the other 360 days when you lose the doping person? Don't you want to just jump off a cliff?
It is. It was so brutally frustrating to, you know, get your ass handed to you all the time by women that I knew that I could beat at one point, and then you know when they start taking drugs. Like, you know, I'll talk about Jeannie Longo because, well, she didn't actually test positive, but her husband got caught buying EPO for the dog. Anyway.
That's way back when I was at ESPN, we did a steroid excuse quiz, and the whole point of the joke was everyone was you had to pick A, B, C, D, and what did the athlete actually say? And the real one was actually hard to pick out because they were so ridiculous. We would just write 3 other ridiculous ones to go with
Tyler Hamilton. I reabsorbed my twin.
Yeah, the unborn twin is pretty good, but the dog needed EPO is pretty awesome. I don't remember that one.
The dog needed EPO. But, you know, anyway, so for a couple of years, Longo, I don't know how many world championships and Olympics she's won.
I think she only just retired last year, at the age of 55 or something like that.
Right.
I mean, she was really obsessive compulsive.
So the first couple of years that we raced, you know, I would beat her by 5 seconds, she'd get me by 10. And it was this fair competition back and forth and back and, you know, and I was still a young racer. I think I was 3rd year into this, 4th year into this. And when you're a beginning racer, you know, you make pretty, you know, 2%, 3% gains, but they're minimal gains, you know, once you get to this point. You know, Longo had been racing, I think, at this point for 12 years. And it was in the 6-week period, I went from being able to beat her by 5 or 10 seconds into a time trial where she's beat me by 2 minutes. What? Yeah. That's exactly what I thought.
Totally normal progression of skill.
Totally normal progression. 12 years into it, now I'm getting beat by 2 minutes, 3 minutes. We're on these climbs, and I always used to be able to out-climb her. Now I can't even touch her. So the infuriating part is here comes the press. And they're like, geez, you know, what happened to you this year? You just really suck. You're like, well, you know, no, actually, I'm feeling pretty darn good this year.
Wait, so they didn't do the basic thing of looking at your times and realizing that you hadn't really changed that much?
So then I have to point this out going, you know, look at my times. I'm actually, you know, I've gotten about a 1 or a 2% improvement. But God, look at her, man. She's 10, 20% improvement. Yeah. But you can't say, can you not tell she's on drugs? Because then it sounds like sour grapes. And so for years, I was able to fight it. But it starts It does get to you, and it starts taking it out of you, because I think towards the latter years, I kind of had this defeatist attitude, like, oh yeah, big hill climb, I'm going to get my ass kicked, and you almost at this point that you don't even really want to try. But every once in a while, I guess when they cycle through their drugs, she'd have an off day, and you'd sense it. I'm like, oh yeah, here we go, you know. And, you know, and then you do get to that point where you start really enjoying those days when they cycle through and they're off, where you can take advantage. You don't have to be the strongest. You learn how to be smarter and try to take advantage of their weaknesses, of their course, is like, the cool thing in cycling is you don't always have to be the strongest to win. It definitely helps. But there's times that you can still win and you're not the strong rider. So you kind of learn how to enjoy that.
I'll get to you. I have a quick follow-up. It seems like for you and other athletes like you who make that choice, I'm not going to dope. You're all sort of on your own. What I mean is like all of the regulation and the efforts to stop this are all coming from the top down. And as John said earlier very eloquently, that's not really working, and that system is waiting for an even bigger Superman to almost fly in from outer space to fix that part of it. And I'm wondering, would it make more sense if we had a new system, and Jill, you might have some thoughts on this too, if it was more from the bottom up, if athletes like yourself who are left in this position of just waiting for the doper to have a bad day, or waiting for the testing to be better somehow, or waiting for the people in charge to be less corrupt, or waiting. What if you were all empowered to actually have more power within the system instead of just being participants that are sort of passive in it?
Kind of slowly happening, and it's interesting how maybe the problem with doping is going to be solved through the Me Too movement, because you get enough women together, like a lot of these women were crying foul. You get enough women together, and you're starting to see a change. And so a gal that I've been talking with, Nancy Hogshead, who won 3 Olympic gold medals in swimming in '84, she's kind of started a movement. I'm just now in the beginning of working with her about change in the United States Olympic Committee, and they're also trying to set up a board, for these women, the safe, what was the name?
Safe Sport, I think it is.
Safe Sport. So there's starting to be a couple of governing boards coming in here, but it's because of the sexual, because of Larry Nassar, that is really getting a lot of these women together. And so Nancy Hogshead, she was raped back when she was in college, so she's motivated, but there's also kind of like a subgroup that's like, we need to change the USOC. And so it's like the athletes are kind of starting to get together. And I started noticing this on Facebook. I know everyone hates it, but I like following this stuff. There's quite a few athletes that are starting to speak out against the USOC.
I mean, they definitely, you mentioned the NCAA.
There's a movement.
Like, there's a lot of economic exploitation of the people at the top of the NCAA, the NCAA too, but the USOC are making a lot of the money that goes into Olympic sports, and the athletes that are actually doing the sports are getting a surprisingly small amount of it. And I think that speaks to the same power dynamic that also pervades anti-doping, which is sort of, it's very top-heavy, and the athletes don't have any say.
Like, I got so, one of the things that drove me out is I got so sick of being used, where you're racing for free. We would, go to the World Championship, bring back medals. It's supposed to be worth $50,000, $100,000 per medal, and I didn't get the money. And there was nothing that I could do about it. So there's like this abuse going on. The athletes are getting used. Like, after I'd been like 2 Olympics, and I set a national record, an unqualified world record, and I didn't have any sponsorship. So I went to the Olympic Committee trying to get money. Oh, there's no money for you. And I'm like, what do you mean? You guys are making millions and millions and millions, and as an athlete, there's no money to help me train. So I fought it. I got $2,500 for the year.
So why can't athletes like yourself who are in that situation, again, whether it's financial or whether it's like situation you described with doping. Or sexual.
Or
all
doping.
All these things where you're looking and you can see there's a problem, there's some wrongdoing, there's something that's not right, that's unjust. But I can't say anything publicly about it. I can't raise a stink. Why is that so hard? Because it is, but why is that hard?
This is why I like being older, because when you're in the sport, all you want to do is just race. And if you start causing a stink, it just makes your life harder. And you're not there to really create a stink. You're there to, race and to train.
Who's going to really have your back if you do? Anyone?
No. you just end up, you suck it up and you race for free. Or like Beckman was saying, you're living in the back of the car, trying to make ends meet.
Like if anyone, when they were in the Ramada, in the very medically safe and sterile Ramada Inn, hanging blood bags on the coat racks.
Like a hospital facility.
Yeah, the blood,
like a hospital facility.
That hadn't been it's just like riding in Pikes Peak. That hadn't been tested properly. It ended up making people sick, and fortunately not more than just fevers. If any athlete had gone to the Los Angeles Times or something and said, you know what, like, this is ridiculous. This is what's happening. I'm going to blow the whistle on this. How do you think it would have played out for them heading into the '84 Olympics?
Well, I mean...
And their future in cycling.
Get out of there.
Over. Just absolutely over. But even, post-Olympics, the athletes, they had already been tainted, like you said, John. They were cast, like Gary Blockus, who is a colleague who wrote for a lot of these stories for the Allentown Morning Call, said, even though they won their medals, they had already been tainted, and so they were cast off by the Olympic Committee. Pat McDonough did stay in the sport. I believe he still lives in Colorado Springs, and did work for the Olympic Training Center for a while. Mark Whitehead died of alcoholism. He also had Hep C, and there has been speculation that he may have picked that up from the blood doping.
Wow.
Again,
Sure.
I don't know. And just out of respect, I didn't want to do too much digging. I didn't want to talk to his widow. I didn't want to bother Ed Burke's widow either. I talked to some of their colleagues. There was an interesting dynamic. I know this is a little off topic, but Eddie B., who I knew somewhat, Inga, you knew him as well, right? I mean, super dynamic figure.
We're trying to avoid him, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah, nobody Eddie B., it's not like he's lovable teddy bear, I mean, he was tough Polish guy. And, people listen to Eddie B. There's still Eddie B. is still alive. He lives in the San Diego area. And there are people who are still absolutely devoted to the cult of Eddie B. But what I'd heard was Ed Burke was, he had a PhD in physiology. He was a recreational cyclist, and he was really trying to insinuate himself into the upper echelons of cycling. So he was really the one who did bring forth the blood doping idea, and kind of kept it going. And Eddie B., I think, if you saw the letters, Eddie B. comes from the East. He is familiar with injectables.
Right.
I've heard a lot of Eddie B. stories, Eddie B. opening up the suitcase, and there is just stuff in there, because that's the way we did it in Poland,
Gotta be such a great coach.
It's one of your signature lines in there. But there are a lot of Eddie B's in cycling now. The one link I could not make, I really, really wanted to connect what happened in 1984 to Lance Armstrong. And the link in there was Chris Carmichael, who was an alternate on the 1984 team and went on to be one of Lance's coaches. But I couldn't get anybody on the record to say, yeah, with what he learned in '84 on the '84 team, he used that to, enhance Lance's career. But I still think he is sort of one of the missing links between what happened in '84 and Lance Armstrong's career. I mean, this is really the first time the U.S. had, you can say, a doping protocol, a systematic doping protocol, as half-assed as it was.
Well, to finish the rest of that story with Chris Carmichael, it was in the late 80s and the early 90s, they were doping all the junior riders without their knowledge. And then a couple of these riders got really, really sick. And then one of them, Gregory Strock, ended up becoming a medical doctor, kind of started looking back in hindsight and realized that he had been doped without his knowledge. So let's get back to the ethics thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty clearly unethical across the board.
To dope somebody's child without their knowledge, why are these people not in jail? They got slapped on the hand, insurance settlement out of court, And, you know, and a non-disclosure statement. I'm sorry, but that's not enough. When you dope somebody's child, they need to be in jail.
Yeah,
I mean, this is somebody's child. I mean, you know, people go to jail for committing, you know, tax fraud or bank fraud or stuff like that. But to dope somebody's child takes it to a whole other level. And the fact that our federation just kind of like, oh, well, we'll pay the insurance claim and we'll cover it up, and Chris Carmichael is still coaching.
Mm-hmm. You had a question, right? And then one here, one there, and we'll wrap it up. Oh, no? Okay.
So you mentioned that you'd be coming from the Eastern Bloc, and as you know, we have these conversations. Is there any sense that we ever sort of like center like American morality and like ideas of like the spirit of the game when we like talk about doping and anti-doping efforts, or have you found that like athletes in other countries have like similar experiences, or?
I think a lot of the athletes have similar experiences. Yeah. And I just got really, really lucky with the genetics that I got, that I was able to compete and not have to play the game. So, what's that?
No, go ahead.
No, so what I went through, for me, it was really hard to watch all these other athletes have to play the game to get onto the team. So I get that I got this body on a silver platter with a really stubborn attitude to go with it, you know, to not play the game. But all the women that I've ever spoken with talk about the pressures that they went under to just get there. I mean, I think a lot of them are almost PT, you know, SD, trying to go through what they went through just to get there to that point. And I didn't have to go through that.
It's a very important point. This is a global culture. Okay? Doping is a global culture. You seem to be implying that there might be a difference between Americans and a lot of other people. One of the things that happened when East Germany fell apart was that there was an exodus of doping experts from East Germany. The big German Newsweekly did an article on them in 1997, and they drew a map on 2 pages. And the East German doping experts had managed to get jobs in about 20 countries. Okay? So in other words, the appetite to dope, the appetite for doping expertise is a global phenomenon. And that's part of the problem.
I think it went mainly to China. Is that correct?
That the female swimming coach is reputed to have gone to China, but they went, no. I don't know exactly how many, but this report said that they were going all over the place. Somebody came here, somebody goes to Switzerland, somebody goes to Sweden, somebody goes to West Germany, it's global.
Yeah, I would say the only difference that sort of I've observed as a journalist, it's kind of the same difference between America and a lot of other places. The desire to dope is the same, the desire to win is the same, the amorality is the same. The difference is that in America, like, we sort of privatize everything. We don't have a ministry of sport. His job is literally to win medals. Like, even the sort of way we've set up our Olympic sports is sort of quasi-privatized. Mm-hmm. So the difference there would just be, instead of the pressure to dope is not going to come from the literal U.S. government, state-sponsored sports program. It's going to come from the individual cycling team. Maybe you join, and the sponsors turn the blind eye, and they've brought in an East German former coach to get results. You're facing the same pressures. It's just not going to be at the Putin-type level where it's actually direct national interest. And we do a lot to subsidize sport through our government, primarily by paying for their stadiums and tax breaks and things like that. We don't try to necessarily manage the results of sports through the government the way other places do. I think that's probably the only real substantial difference in terms of the pressures a particular athlete would face to dope that are not just their own internal pressure to win.
Yeah, the United States the government got out of the Olympic sports business exactly 40 years ago with the Amateur Athletics Act. And so, as Patrick points out, you don't have direct pressure the president or from the senators or that sort of thing, which is a very, very healthy thing. But that doesn't mean that the population of elite American athletes are not going through the same set of experiences and pressures and temptations that people are in different social systems.
I think we good on one more question, anybody?
Okay.
Yeah, we got one in the back. Hold on.
Oh, well, all right, one last question. Yeah. Well, first to comment, I got to know Cheryl Hayworth fairly well. She was a bronze medalist in Sydney in weightlifting, and she told me that she was tested to death, that they would show up 13 times a year unannounced and test her. So I think to defend the U.S., we test more rigorously now. Whether the tests are honest and whether they're escaping the test is another matter. But I think and it's one of the reasons we haven't done better in weightlifting, is that we cheat less. Okay, my other point is,
there's difference between going like 120 and 60 or 75, right? You go to the speed limit. It's still one's faster than the other. I see what you're saying.
The other thing is, what really resonated to me in the film was early John's comment that he wasn't a fan, and then I think that goes to the heart of it here. And he says, what really interests me, he says, I don't root for any of these. I'm interested in what's going on underneath there. And I feel exactly the same way. I am not a fan. And but I go broader than John. I still enjoy sports because I like to watch fan behavior. I enjoy watching adults acting like children, fueled by alcohol and money that they're throwing in to these sports, and coaches' salaries and professional players and all the rest of it. And then the media is just fanning all this to death, and getting the fans more and more excited. The problem to me is fans. Now, let me tell you one quick story. The other night, we had this big awards. Anybody from kinesiology in here? Oh, you are? Sport management. Oh, okay. Well, that's kinesiology, isn't it? Yeah, okay. We had this. Were you at the awards ceremony? Okay, they had this big awards ceremony, and after it, then, everybody stood, and they sang, "The eyes of Texas are upon you," and everybody did this, except me. I just stood there, solid. I didn't stand, but I stood there solid, and the camera then came around. I thought, oh my God, you're going to see me, and I'm not a fan. I'm going to be expelled or something. I'm going to be ostracized. But I feel the same way. I teach at two major universities, here and at Auburn, and they're exactly the same way at Auburn. And what I can't understand is that we have all these smart people, and they're fans. They're stupid. It's stupid behavior. And it's driving all this stuff that we're talking about here tonight. If it weren't for the fans, we wouldn't have this bizarre fixation on money. There wouldn't be drugs driving the athletes to do better, so the fans will like them and they'll get more lucrative contracts. And go ahead, sorry.
You know what I have found? I've really, on this same note, that I have really started to enjoy watching, and a lot of it's because the press is covering it more, so you guys are okay after all. But they're covering women's sports a lot more. And watching the women's hockey, watching women's soccer, the last few, women's bike races that I've watched, there still isn't a lot of money there. I'm sure that there's still drugs going on, but it's not to the level that the men have, just maybe because there's not quite as much money or there's not quite the fanfare. But there's a real purity to the sport still with the women, because they're not this huge, big, bulky behemoth. I mean, you're actually seeing...
Wait till we close the gender gap.
Yeah, I know. But it's still, right now with the women, I mean, there's still just like these beautiful women that are also incredible athletes.
Yeah,
and
it's not off the road yet.
Yeah, so there's still some purity there. I don't know how much longer it'll last, but...
I think your point is well taken about a lot of this is driven by sort of fans and what we're willing to not only tolerate but celebrate.
And that was your thing about,
Yeah.
What
I mean,
cut off
right.
Second Amendment, right? We'll just shoot them all.
They're the lifeblood of all of it. So maybe you don't.
We're not going to stop the fans, but unfortunately, we are going to have to stop the conversation. Can we give a round of applause to our panelists, please?